Hey, well, hi everyone. Welcome. My name is Gina Howell. I'm from the Sustainability Center here at Southeastern. I hope you all are having a great Monday so far. We are recording today's presentation, and we'll share a link with you guys in the email tomorrow. So if you could just please mute your mics until the Q&A at the end, which would be really awesome. We'd appreciate that. So if you haven't been to one of our talks before, you know that we actually started Green Talk Series 3 years ago to promote environmental literacy on campus and our community. And since then, we've had presentations on so many different things from recycling to renewable energy, green business, and wetland conservation. And those are just to name a short few. And the topic today is clean energy, greenwashing, and the just transition. So we are so excited to have Ms. Rachel Stevens, an assistant professor at Environmental Justice Clinic from the Vermont Law School, speak today. So Ms. Stevens will discuss clean energy programs, how to avoid greenwashing, and all about just the whole just transition framework. So welcome to our Green Talk, Ms. Stevens.
Thank you for having me. No one actually calls me Miss Stevens, so feel free to call me Rachel. I am really excited to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation, Gina. So this is inspired by a presentation that I recently gave at the Tulane Environmental Law Conference, which is based a lot on the work that I do at the Environmental Justice Clinic at Vermont Law School. So before I jump in, I'm gonna share my screen. So I have a couple visuals that might be helpful. So give me just a moment. See if I can do this. I practiced it, Gina, based on your direction. So
You're awesome.
give me a second. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Okay, perfect. Usually we do class in Zoom, so I'm getting used to the new framework here. Okay, awesome. Are you guys seeing that? Let's see if
Yes, we
I
sure
can get
can.
it full screen.
Yes.
Oh, hopefully it's full screen for you guys. Can you see it full screen or are you still seeing? I guess it doesn't matter if you can see the slides, but so thanks Gina again for having me. I am an attorney at the Environmental Justice Clinic at Vermont Law School. This is I want to find out more about your programs too and what students take at your institution, but we are essentially a public interest law firm on campus. So law students that are we actually take law students and master's students that are on campus at our school. They can work at the Environmental Justice Clinic and represent clients and communities directly on cases and projects. We do anything from civil rights litigation to, challenging Clean Air Act permits. And yeah, I really got my start. I've been working at the clinic since 2014, and I've worked on everything from Clean Water Act permit challenges. I've done a lot of energy infrastructure um, projects or cases challenging, for instance, natural gas pipelines, oil pipelines. We've worked on some of the Keystone Line 3 casework on behalf of tribes in the Midwest. A lot of my casework that I've done recently that I'm going to talk about today is based in New Jersey. Our clinic represents the the Ironbound Community Corporation in New Jersey. They're one of the organizations that led the fight to get a groundbreaking environmental justice law in the state, and we do a lot of work there in Newark. Gina, are you seeing my slides, or is it just showing the main one here? Can't tell.
I'm seeing the front. If you want to go ahead and press, let's see, if you go to slideshow, just go to
Let me
slideshow at the top bar
see.
right there in the
Yeah, I'm
power
not seeing that. It looks like I'm present on my screen. It says I'm
present.
presenting.
There's a
So
present mode there somewhere.
hang on, I realized it wasn't switching with
That's so
my.
fun. You can even just do it through there too, and we can still see if that's okay
Okay,
with you.
let me try that. Sorry, guys.
Oh, you're so fun.
Okay, I'll just click through here. But these are some of the students I was just going to show you from our clinic, and it's really exciting. I mean, I graduated from Vermont Law School in 2013, and I worked as a student at the clinic. I think it's wonderful to have kind of that practical experience, get to represent communities, be on the ground, and I think hands-on learning is one of the best things in my view. So I just wanted to give a little overview. I'm not sure how much background you all have in clean energy, but I wanted to define a few terms like net metering and community solar. I do a lot of work with renewable portfolio standards, so I thought I would define that for you, and then talk a little bit about greenwashing, what I've seen in some of the cases that we've been doing. And this is really an emerging field, especially as there's a renewed focus on environmental justice and climate justice. A lot of industries are going to be and are already starting to frame their businesses in those terms as a way to benefit from subsidies, or like there's a new bill in front of Congress being considered now, the Clean Futures Act. And so there's a lot, like my red flags and our clients' red flags are really going up in terms of industries that are claiming that they're going to be good for the clean energy climate future, but certainly aren't. So we'll talk about some of those like quote false solutions from the frame of environmental justice, and then I'll define just transition, which is a movement in and of itself. Feel free to ask questions as I'm going if any of these terms are new to you. But net metering are policies that allow residents with solar panels to get paid for energy they generate. It's a pretty, I mean, there's a lot more to it than that, but I think that's the basics, is that if you have solar on your home, that you can generate electricity and be paid by your utility for what you're putting back into the grid. And so community solar projects actually take advantage of this, but you may have, for instance, community members that are tenants, they don't own their property, or they may not be able to afford solar on their homes themselves. And so it's almost like a cooperative where it allows a community to invest in a solar, like for instance, you see a solar array here that gets paid to put money back into the grid. So this is a way that the community can benefit from solar. And there's a great website if you are interested. I put the link there and I can put it in the chat later, where you can actually see what renewable energy incentives and subsidies are in each state. This is kind of interesting because I think until you kind of do a deeper dive, it may be new information for some folks. So this is a really important concept, this renewable portfolio standard requirement. Essentially what it means, it's a requirement by law in a specific state. So it's a state law passed by a legislature that mandates a certain percentage of electricity that utilities must source that is renewable or clean. And so, for instance, in New Jersey, there's a renewable portfolio standard that says that utilities need to purchase, 5% of the electricity they sell to customers needs to come from renewable energy sources. So the way that this can benefit clean energy, like solar and wind, is that it's basically a required customer. So the utilities have to get renewable energy credits or source electricity from renewable sources in order to benefit from the program and to meet the requirements of the law. But what's tricky here is how states define renewable. So we'll talk about this a little bit, but many states allow industries that we would not normally consider clean or renewable energy to be considered renewable in their renewable portfolio standards. So instead of sending those subsidies and that benefiting what we think of as solar and wind, it's actually benefiting things like waste incinerators, large hydro, like even like sludge processing in facilities, lots of incineration, biomass, things like that. So a renewable energy credit, again, this is a very kind of tricky concept, but I think it's really important for this conversation, and certainly some of the casework I've been doing recently, it's essentially like a certificate where it represents the attribute of something being renewable. So just for an example, for every megawatt hour that a solar panel, every megawatt hour of electricity that a solar panel produces, they also generate this credit that then is sold in a marketplace, like bought and sold. So if you are a generator you have solar, you put your renewable energy certificates into the marketplace. So you say, I have generated 50 megawatt hours from my solar panel, and I am now selling 50 credits. So utilities who have this RPS requirement, is what we call it, they can purchase those credits to meet their RPS requirements. So they don't actually have to like own and generate the electricity themselves. They can purchase these attributes from renewable energy sources. And so this is what a REC is. It's the kind of the RPS market. This can be really tricky. I mean, as with any kind of regulated marketplace, in Vermont, for instance, we saw a situation where the utility and generators were kind of double counting. So the utility was purchasing electricity where the RECs had already been sold. So like, for instance, a solar panel had produced 5 megawatt hours, but those RECs had been sold out of state. For instance, somebody already bought the attribute, but then the utility was using the electricity, but it no longer had that attribute, and they were saying that that was renewable. So that would be consumer fraud. And actually, there was a case in Vermont against that. And I'm going to share an example of in New Jersey the way that some of like waste incinerators and some of these other industries are taking advantage of this marketplace. But I just wanted to mention this framework because I think it's news to a lot of people that there is like a marketplace where there's a actual credit system, and some of these market mechanisms are in place. So I mean, as with anything, it kind of always comes back to the money and where that's being placed, and where that's going. So just, I mean, this is probably not news to you, the term greenwashing, but this is a big way that a lot of environmental justice communities get harmed from businesses that are saying they're renewable energy, but are actually producing just as much air pollution as any other major source. And one of the examples I'm going to talk about, waste incineration, has even found to be more polluting than coal-fired power plants, which we would kind of all accept as like, that's not renewable, that's not clean. But these industries are kind of taking advantage of these systems. So this idea of false solutions is really important in the conversation of climate change. I mean, obviously, I mean, there's a rich history here, and I'd be glad to talk about this in the Q&A if you all have questions. And because I think if you've got kind of the traditional environmental law framework where you think, okay, climate change is an existential threat to all of us and to the environment, and we need to do whatever we can to move away from from fossil fuels as quickly as possible, and that result of doing that will benefit people that are impacted. So it's more important to move quickly in this transition than it is to actually listen to communities that are on the ground that are being impacted. That is really a problem. And so a lot of these kind of quote false solutions are ones that are being in some ways promoted by kind of the traditional environmental law, or just environmental organizations, or just even in environmental education, as these are good solutions. But they actually, if you look at it from a community lens, they might actually not be the best solution. So some of these that are listed here are things that you're like, wow, this is a good thing. This is part of our solution for climate change, but it's actually not part of what's called the just transition. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, but this infographic is from the Just Transition Alliance. So if you want to learn more about Just Transition, I definitely recommend you check out their website, jtalliance.org. There's a lot of things here like carbon markets and cap and trade is a huge, any market mechanism for trading is definitely something that is a concern to environmental justice communities, because you're not actually removing pollution from those communities. So if you think about like, I don't know if anyone's heard of the Transportation Climate Initiative or some of the other like there's a regional greenhouse gas initiative called RGGI in New England, and obviously California has a lot of market mechanisms, and you're like, that seems like a great idea, put a price on carbon. But it doesn't actually remove the kind of externalities of the pollution. So that's something that you might not think about if you're not thinking about it from an environmental justice lens. Other things like nuclear energy, like where does that waste go? One of the biggest problems for EJ communities is waste. I mean, a lot of our waste management, trash, hazardous waste is all disposed of at landfills or in incinerators that are in communities of color. And so that's another kind of false solution. So some of the ones that I'm going to talk about today are incineration and biofuels, but also some of the geoengineering is also not quite it's actually not removing the impacts from the communities on the ground. So it may be, quote, good for the climate, but not good for people that are being impacted by the pollution today. So that's kind of setting up the framework. And again, I think this is a really rich area for discussion. So I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on this. So one of the industries that I deal with the most is called waste to energy. This covers basically any time you're processing or burning something that's considered, quote, waste and destroying it. So it seems like a great thing because you're removing waste or destroying waste. And a lot of these facilities also produce electricity. So you're like, okay, win-win. We have eliminated waste and we've produced energy. So this is something that I think is being promoted widely as like, this is a great solution. We've got a lot of trash. We've got a lot of waste, and this is, one of the ways that we should deal with it. So some of those examples are, as I mentioned, biomass, which kind of literally burns like either wood chips or construction waste or lumber or things like that, kind of organic matter. There's municipal solid waste incineration, which is the destruction of like our household waste. This picture here is the Covanta Essex incinerator in Newark, New Jersey. Which burns almost all the trash from New York City. This is the facility that I spend the most time dealing with enforcement issues and Clean Air Act issues, and I represent a lot of the community members that live around here. So that's called municipal solid waste incineration. There's also hazardous and medical waste incineration, which have higher standards for their operations and what they can burn. And then there's something else I've been dealing with recently is human sewage and sludge, chemical sludge, sewage incineration, which is something I had never heard of before this year. But if incineration is a fancy word for like basically a dumpster fire. That's what it is. We're setting things on fire in order to destroy the organic matter, which of course produces a lot. I think I have a slide here about the kind of some of the other externalities besides producing electricity. Ash is one of the biggest byproducts of this combustion process for any of these processes. And if you know anything about just kind of even just thinking about your fireplace at home, or if you were to like burn anything, it's not totally destroyed. You're actually producing ash, and oftentimes the ash concentrates heavy metals and other pathogens in different types of ash. Fly ash actually can leave the facility through the stack. Again, just think of kind of like burning a fire in your household fireplace. And ash may be considered hazardous even if it's not hazardous coming in. So you may just be burning household trash in an incinerator, but the ash may then become hazardous because of the way it concentrates all the pollution. So that's kind of an interesting byproduct that that these facilities have to deal with. And then also air pollution is the biggest externality and the biggest impact for our clients. And what's interesting about waste incineration, it actually produces more pollutants per hour of energy than any other form of energy generation, including coal. So we just produced, this is a report that I worked on that was published a few weeks ago. One of the reasons why I spoke about this at Tulane is because this report had just come out about, we're calling it New Jersey's dirty secret, and how waste incinerators are taking advantage of renewable energy subsidies. But some of the pollutants that you may have heard of or that you may be aware of are mercury, lead, nitrogen oxide, carbon monoxide, and obviously greenhouse gases. This incinerator, the one I had a picture of, it's actually the largest source of air pollution in the state of New Jersey. And if you look across the country, incinerators are some of the largest polluters in their communities. Let me show you some slides. I can share the report too if you all are interested in looking at it later. So this is a really sad statistic, but if we look at the 58 incinerators, about 79% of them are actually located in Black communities. There's a lot of ways that we can find that data, basic census data. There's also a tool called the EPA EJ screen, where you can look at different indices like where are Superfund sites, where are the hazardous waste sites, and it creates like an index or a percent number of this community is a concentrated community of people of color, people below X number of poverty. And so here we can see the red are both poverty and people of color, the orange is people of color, the yellow is poverty, and then the white is no EJ community. So 58 or 79% of these incinerators are actually in Black communities, and burning trash often from other like white communities. In the case of Newark, and New York City, it's a pretty stark example of all the trash literally being burned across the river. Interesting if you compare this is a map showing which states include incineration in their renewable portfolio standards. And I think at last count, it was somewhere between 11 and 12 have some form of incineration, whether it's biomass incineration, considered renewable. And this is another report I can share. The Tishman School at New School and the Institute for Local Self-Reliance have done a lot of studies on this. And it's not by accident. So this industry, like every industry, the American petroleum industry, has very well-funded lobbyists that are actively engaged in state efforts across the states or across the country. So anytime a community is considering a renewable portfolio standard, you have waste to energy lobbyists that are right there making sure that that definition does not just say solar and wind, but it includes other waste to energy alternatives. And certainly they do not talk about air pollution. They do not talk about the community impacts, which are universally just really poor. Another interesting tidbit just from my research is that most of these incinerators are owned by the same company called Covanta. So it's really interesting when we've seen kind of some industry-wide trends. It's also kind of the same company, not doing upgrades or its violations of its permit. So that's another piece that I work on a lot, is making sure to enforce the operating permits for these incinerators. And I've actually never seen a waste incinerator comply with its air permits. So all the incinerators in New Jersey have been in violation of their air permits essentially every year that they've been in operation, which is a huge problem when we're talking about this industry. So this is a picture of just some of the clients. And when we think about, I think one line we hear a lot from waste incinerators in terms of like promoting this solution is that, well, the alternative is that this would go to landfills, and that the organic matter or whatever you're not burning is actually going to be producing greenhouse gases in the landfill, and like this is a better alternative. But when we think about just transition, and I'm going to define the term here for you, but the solution is really a bigger solution. So rather than accepting that frame that, well, the trash has to go somewhere, why don't we think about, why are we producing so much trash? Why are we producing so much waste that we have to burn it in these communities? And so I think it's not a one-to-one. So you can't accept that frame, or that's unacceptable for environmental justice communities. They have a whole different frame. Like, why can't we have a healthy economy that works for everyone? And if it means that we have to stop incineration and actually confront how much trash we're burning every day and every year, and stop hiding the externalities of our like market systems, then maybe that is what we need to do. Because what we're producing now, I mean, if you think about, like, if you drive around Newark, which is a place that I visit quite frequently because we have so many clients there, pretty much everything that you've ever bought off Amazon, or I mean, if you're on the East Coast, kind of, I'm originally from the South too, but this whole region of the country, everything that we're importing for the most part is coming in through the ports in Newark, the ports in Baltimore and other places along the coast. But I can show a video or send a video link for you all if you want to watch. There's a great film. It's only 30 minutes long, called The Sacrifice Zone, that kind of does a tour of the community, and you can really see what this looks like on the ground. So some of the other kind of false solutions, and then I would love to take some questions after I tee this up. A new emerging field that I've been paying a lot of attention to in my research is called factory farm gas, sometimes referred to as biogas or methane gas. This is essentially capturing methane from factory farms or concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. This is basically where all our meat comes from, where they're actually capturing the methane gas, refining it, and then it becomes natural gas. So it actually just gets put right back into the natural gas pipeline system. This is an industry that is heavily promoting itself as pro climate, because they're taking methane that would otherwise be sent into the atmosphere, without realizing the way that this is actually propping up fossil fuel industries and propping up a factory farming industry that is also destructive to EJ communities. So I could show you the same map that I showed you for waste incinerators. If you looked at where all of the concentrated animal feeding operations are in the country, it's even more stark in terms of the percent historic Black, where if you look at the pig farms in North Carolina or in California, it's almost entirely in Black communities. And there's a lot of concern in those communities that creating a new byproduct or this type of new industry for basically capturing the gas is actually going to prop up this industry when we need to be moving to more sustainable farming practices. This is different when biogas and digester technology like anaerobic digestion. I'm not sure if you've heard of that, but it can be used effectively in smaller farm areas. So I'm not suggesting that this is like anaerobic digestion as a technology is a false solution, but certainly in the factory farm context. So we recently saw that Smithfield, which produces the pigs in North Carolina, signed a contract with Duke Energy to promote this. And so they're seeing it as a win-win for factory farms. It's a win-win for maintaining natural gas. So this is an industry that we're looking closely at. Another one of these kind of quote false solutions or something that we've seen communities have concern about, and this is especially true for impacts to indigenous communities, are kind of these mega dams or big hydropower. So for instance, in Vermont, most of our quote renewable electricity comes from Hydro-Quebec, which is a huge dam in Quebec, Canada. But the dam itself actually flooded and displaced a huge indigenous population and destroyed that environment. So obviously, hydropower can be good in some contexts and is often included in renewable definitions as renewable energy, but it can have its own destructive impact. So there's the organization that does this is called Mega Dams, Mega Damage, and so you can check out their website if you're interested. So what is the solution? Because I think a lot of what these industries are doing is taking advantage of the waste and pollution that we already produce as a society. They are, coming up with another way to deal with it that produces electricity, and that seems like a win. And as I mentioned, maybe we need to take a different frame. So this is a definition of just transition, which in and of itself has a long history, but I'll just read it out for you, and this is my last slide. A just transition is a set of principles, processes, and practices of shifting economic and political power from an extractive economy toward a low carbon, climate resilient economy that maximizes the benefit of climate action while minimizing hardships for workers and their communities. At the core of this approach is the fair treatment of workers in the transition so that those that have been most negatively impacted by polluting practices directly benefit from future economic opportunities. So there's a lot going on in this space, some of the Green New Deal and some other thinking about, job training, and even just thinking about like West Virginia, moving coal miners to working in solar and that kind of thing. All of that is a part of this thinking about how can we change our economy so it better works for people that are being impacted, rather than just trying to accept the status quo and fix things that way. So that's just kind of an overview. As I mentioned, my role in this space is as a lawyer. So, I could talk more about, I'm obviously not on the front lines. I'm not like a community organizer. I represent these communities in lawsuits that help achieve these goals. So I'd be glad to also think about that as, I'm just in whatever you all are interested in your perspective. But there's my contact information. I'll share it with Gina too, so she can share it with you. Let me stop sharing my screen so I can see your faces. Yeah, so I'll leave it there. I know we want to make some time for Q&A, and I kind of threw a lot of like truth bombs at you, and I'd love to hear your reactions or answer any questions about the clinic or the casework that I'm doing. So.
Okay, Gina, there's nothing in the chat, so anyone with questions, just go ahead and take control of the mic.
Hi, I'll go if it's all right. Thank you, Rachel. That was excellent. Really appreciate it. So I have a question about capturing the methane from the CAFOs. How do they get it? Is it through the waste lagoons? And how do they pull it out of the waste lagoons? Like, how are they capturing it?
Yeah, so it is through the waste lagoons, and actually it does require additional infrastructure. So I don't know if anyone was following the Atlantic Coast Pipeline fight, which was a pipeline proposed to go through the East Coast. It was successfully stopped actually in the fall. It was announced that it was stopped the same week that the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Keystone Access Pipeline were all shut down too. So I think it kind of got lost in the shuffle, but if you look at the design for that pipeline, it was actually designed to go, you could trace all the CAFOs that it was going to pick up along the way. So it would require additional pipeline infrastructure in order to actually get the natural gas from the factory farm. So essentially they would capture it over the waste lagoons, which are huge, I mean, enormous. And I showed a picture, it looked kind of like a blanket or like a tarp kind of over it. So it's a pretty, rudimentary technology at its core, then captures the methane, and then it would have to be transported to a place where it's refined, and then it can go right into the grid or right into the pipeline system with traditional natural gas. So it does require additional infrastructure. But there are also, because anaerobic digestion is a really interesting kind of emerging technology in the smaller farm context. So like Vermont has a lot of experimental anaerobic digesters at smaller farm operations, which are actually working really well. So but in those cases, they actually can use the electricity that they produce to just stay in the grid and actually to help the local community versus the factory farm level industrial scale biogas and factory farm, which is really propping up both natural gas and the factory farm. So that's where I think the concerns are there, that it's not going to work at the industrial scale in terms of removing the impacts from those industries. So we should, like the communities would say, we need to be producing less methane, not trying to capture the methane itself. And also, if you've studied anything about natural gas, even once it's in the pipeline, the leaks are enormous. There's a lot of ways that the infrastructure can fail. And methane, is basically 4 times more potent than CO2 in terms of a greenhouse gas. So anything having to do with methane, the conversation should really be about reduction, not capture, is kind of the punchline for that.
Yeah, and those lagoons, they're unregulated, right? So like the EPA doesn't regulate them, right? So does that add an extra layer of...
Yeah, if you are interested in looking closely at factory farms, there's a huge kind of corruption of that whole industry in terms of our environmental regulation. I mean, so the Clean Water Act does regulate CAFOs, but there are a lot of, like in North Carolina, they don't even report. They don't even know where all of the CAFOs are located in the state. And oftentimes the many advocates are suing, like either the state won't even require a farm to get a permit, like a Clean Water Act permit. And if they do have a permit, they may be violating it. And so there's an enforcement issue and also a permitting issue. But this is a huge problem in terms of water pollution. And if farms are kind of the quote sacred cow when it comes to policy, and oftentimes can benefit from subsidies and lack of regulation and oversight. So yeah, again, I'm not doing that justice, but there's a lot there in terms of work that needs to be done. But again, the Waterkeeper Alliance actually has a great, they've been using drones and planes to actually find and identify all CAFOs and put them on a map. So they're kind of they've created their own mapping tool to identify where all of these CAFOs are located. So that's been a really interesting, if you're interested in digging into that, looking at the Waterkeeper Alliance resources is a great place to start.
Thank you.
So when you speak about incineration, do you ever did any study with gasification, or is only incineration?
Yeah, actually, so I am a very new expert to gasification because I've just been working on opposing a sludge gasification facility in New Jersey. I had never heard of gasification before because most of my practice had been incineration. And my understanding is that the biggest difference is the way, it's the type of combustion. So in incineration, it's essentially combustion in the presence of oxygen, and gasification, my rudimentary understanding is that it's kind of destruction through heat in the absence of oxygen. So it kind of vaporizes what it's destroying. But there's still air pollution in gasification. So what we've been looking at recently, and we have a case right now in New Jersey, is opposing a gasification plant that is, producing a lot of air pollution. I think that's the biggest concern, is that it's not actually reducing greenhouse gases and air pollution in the way that the industry is framing it. But I don't know if you have specifics about if you looked at gasification, or if that's something that but yeah, it's impressive that you know that. I mean, it was a new topic for me until recently, but
yeah, I actually work.
It's an emerging field for sure.
Yeah, I work in a company doing biomass gasification for. We try to implement one of these systems here at the university. It's supposed, because there is absence of oxygen, like you have less metal and less gases, but there is still problems still.
Well, and I think when you think about these industries, I think it's important to think about the communities within which they're located, because obviously we have a system where some level of air pollution is acceptable under the Clean Air Act. So, we have to have, I'm not suggesting that we eliminate or that it's even possible to eliminate all air pollution. But what we're really what I'm really talking about, and what our clients are really talking about, are communities that are already considered overburdened. So either they're currently not meeting their ambient air quality standards under the Clean Air Act, so they actually cannot take any additional air pollution, or the community is an environmental justice community. So it's a Black community, low income, and that these communities are just not the right places for those industries. So I think when we think about false solutions, and of course, and I guess the way I teed up the conversation is to target the industries, but the reason to target those industries is because of where they have historically been located, which are all concentrated together in industrial areas. So yes, I think gasification is a better alternative than incineration, but it still does not resolve the question of, is this community a community that can handle any level of additional air pollution? And so when you sit in on the community meetings, as I mentioned, we've been opposing a sludge gasification plant in New Jersey. The questions from the community are well, I don't care that it's only, the company will say, well, it's only an additional, X tons per year of this pollutant. And it's really small in comparison to the largest source of air pollution that you have in the whole state, but it's still additional. It's additive. And in some cases the term that we use is cumulative impact. So what is the cumulative impact of this industry in addition to all the other industries that you currently have? So, but I appreciate your point. So it's not to, demonize an industry per se, but to suggest that where these facilities are located and placed, these are historically overburdened communities that they can't take any more pollution. And if you want to read more about this idea of kind of cumulative impacts or overburdened communities, there's a great book called The Color of Law, which talks about the historic redlining and placement of industrial zones in America. So where were industrial zones placed, and connect that to where Black people were allowed to purchase homes, for instance. And there's a direct correlation between industrial zones and Black communities. So I think that's the lens with which I'm suggesting that we look at these industries, is who's being impacted, where are things being located. But yeah, I appreciate your perspective for sure. I mean, I think, it's a complex problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that you make a really good point, Rachel, because so many of these communities are already being polluted by these existing industries. And and here's where the greenwashing comes in, right? Because these industries have gotten a bad rap, and now they get to say, "Oh, look what good stuff we're doing," right? And they're and sort of like pull the veil or sort of do away with the idea that they're really polluting these communities so much by saying, "Oh, we're turning this into renewable energy or whatever," right? While they're still polluting these communities that are underrepresented and don't have a lot of political power and resources and all that stuff. So
yeah, and I think I mean, kind of another way to think about it, and maybe it was at Alejandro that you raised the question about gasification, is so not only should a company or even us like consumers be thinking about where, but also how. So how is, like, when a community or a company is coming into a community, what type of public engagement and input is there into the process? And because oftentimes when I've seen this type of development, the company already has purchased a site and has already like begun to apply for permits before even considering, like, hey, there's a school down the street and this school, and so oftentimes when I get involved, when a lawyer is involved, things are already like beyond the point of conversation. And we're getting involved because we have to challenge a company or sue an industry. But in terms of like a just transition model and thinking about what environmental justice principles really mean, it means people have a say in decision making that affects their lives. So the fact that somebody could say, and maybe it does make sense for a community to have for instance, sewage gasification. Like, sewage sludge is a huge problem. Like, even if we could eliminate, sorry to talk about sewage because I guess a gross topic, but it's important. Even if we were able to reduce the amount of municipal solid waste that we produce, like, we can't eliminate the urban environment and the fact that there are people that live there. Like, we produce the sewage that we produce. So in some ways and that's something that like Vermont has been dealing with. Like, how do we actually dispose of that sewage waste? You can treat it for land application, but that's kind of controversial because there's other pollutants like PFAS chemicals that you can't remove through waste treatment. And so in some cases, like, sewage gasification may be important as a like societal way to deal with that. But in order to have that conversation, communities need to be involved in understanding what are the impacts, where is this going to be located, what are the benefits. So it's not just it's not so black and white. It's also about how decisions are made and how public is engaged in the process of those things. Just wanted to throw that in the mix too.
I love that so much. This is such an enlightening talk. Thank you so much, Ms. Rachel. I do have a quick question. On a fundamental level, what do you think are some steps and actions we consumers can take to just avoid being greenwashed and to like mitigate the effects of some of the industries and these companies? I know you touched on community involvement and engaging the public. How would you recommend to someone who is just getting introduced to all these things? And yeah, I want your thoughts on that. I would love to hear.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I'm kind of like I'm of two minds. So I'll just put it out there and then you can wrestle with it. On the one hand, I do think personal responsibility and personal choice and consumer choice is important. But I also think that emphasis on like you, Gina, and you have to do something also takes the pressure off of the systemic problems that we confront. And so I don't want to suggest at all that, I mean, yes, you could choose not to purchase from Amazon and buy local. Like, that would be great. You could also consider how much trash like my husband and I made our trash small and our recycling bin really big. So we try to produce more recycling than we produce trash. Like, you can do that in your home. But when we think about the like systemic racism and we think about environmental justice issues, that's a societal problem. And actually, probably the most important thing that we could do right now is make sure that we have a right to vote and that we are participating in civic engagement and that we are electing officials that actually have, are protecting our democracy. So I struggle with that because it's like, yes, I want to take and encourage personal responsibility and action. And I don't want to suggest that there's like nothing that we can do, but I also think that we have to pay attention to our political environment, because this is where these decisions are being made. As I mentioned, the renewable portfolio standards, those are sneaking through because people don't even realize that that's happening at their state level, or they just hear, great renewable portfolio standard, I'm for it, without really digging in and thinking about what does this mean, who is this benefiting. For instance, I know you guys are in Louisiana, and I have a case in Louisiana, and one of the presenters that was presenting with me on this panel was talking about the renewable portfolio standard for New Orleans. So there actually is like a proposal, but like the devil's in the details, and you have to be engaged in that process. So yeah, so that's not an easy answer, but I do think getting involved in your local politics and making sure that you vote and that you're paying attention to what's happening in your state is really important. And again, a lot of this is happening at the state level, because states have a lot of control in terms of their, regulating their industry. States actually can administer Clean Air Act. They have delegated authority, so they can administer permits. So you can actually comment, submit a public comment on an application, or participate in a public comment process for, a legislative initiative. And I think that engagement in the democratic process is probably like the most important thing that we could do. But yeah, there's a lot more to say about that, but I struggle with that a lot.
Yeah, in sustainability, there's this fine balance between this individualistic approach and the collective approach. So I can see how you're going about that. I love that. I love it so much. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I actually heard, I don't know if this is true, but I actually heard that the carbon footprint identifier was actually an industry created idea, as a way to, which again is so interesting, because I want to know, like, what's my carbon footprint, and like, am I contributing to climate change? But the amount of carbon, not to say that our choices don't matter, but the amount of carbon that you, Gina, produce versus the industry-wide incentives and those decisions that are being made at it really pales in comparison. So it's yeah, I just throw that out there for all of us to think about.
Does anyone else have any questions? Any questions at all? We're learning so much. Thank you. I think that's about it. Thank you so much, Miss Rachel, for talking with us today. That was so enlightening, honestly. It was such a great presentation, so I really appreciate it. Next week, everyone,
yeah,
our hopefully
just sparked some conversation.
It did, yeah, especially. I know I'm going to be definitely communicating that with people. And we have a few links and stuff that you recommended. I've been writing down, and I'll email those out to everyone here as well. But our next Green Talk next week is Wednesday, April 28th at 1 p.m. We have Dr. Mark Benefiel from LSU's Oceanography and Coastal Science Department, and he'll be talking about the 2020 New Orleans nurdle spill, which is tracking the path of the hundreds of millions of plastic pellets from the shipping container. So stay tuned for that. We'd love to have all y'all there. And that is it for today's Green Talk. So thank you so much, everyone, and I hope y'all all have a great afternoon. Thank you, Miss Rachel. Thank you so much.